Before we come to the UQ, we begin with this urgent question. I remind all members that Erskine May states the conduct of members of the House of Lords can only be criticised on a substantive motion and therefore not during these exchanges. Also, while there is in the prospect of further legal proceedings concerning some of the contracts entered into, I would like to remind members of the sub judice resolution and the requirement not to refer to live cases. I now come to the urgent question. Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will try and stay in my lane. To ask the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster if he will make a statement on the due diligence and performance management performed on the public procurement of personal protective equipment during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, sourcing, producing and distributing PPE is, even in normal times, a uniquely complex challenge. However, the efforts to do this during a pandemic, at a time when global demand was never higher, were truly extraordinary. And early on in that pandemic, our priority was clear: to get PPE to the front line as quickly as possible. And all of us in this House will remember that moment and how desperate we all were to see PPE delivered to the front line. During the course of the pandemic, nearly at the peak, 400 staff were working on sourcing protective equipment, and tens of billions of items were sourced. We worked at pace to source new deals from around the globe, and we buy always and source PPE to the highest of standards, quality and best value for money. Over the course of the programme, due diligence was done over 19,000 companies, and over 2,600 companies made it through that initial due diligence. With huge demand from PPE all across the world, and with many countries introducing export bans, our risk appetite had to change, and we had to throw everything behind our effort to protect those who protect us and those who needed it most. We had to balance the risk of contracts not performing and supplies being priced at a premium against the crucial risk to the health of frontline care workers, the NHS and the public if we failed to get the PPE that we so desperately needed. And as well as due diligence checks, there was systematic price benchmarking as well. Prices were evaluated against the need for a product, the quantity available, how soon it was available, and the specification of the product. And many deals were rejected or renegotiated as initial prices offered were not acceptable. Mr. Speaker, there are always lessons we can learn from any crisis, but we must not lose sight of the huge national effort that took place to protect the most vulnerable, and I thank officials who worked on it, while we tackled one of the greatest threats to our public health that this nation has ever seen.
Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. And can I welcome the Minister to his place? I think it's the first time we've met each other at the dispatch box. But to be honest, Mr. Speaker, the defence of due diligence, I would say, what due diligence? Yeah. Last night, documents seen by The Guardian revealed that yet another case of taxpayers' money was wasted, a total failure of due diligence and a conflict of interest at the heart of government procurement. In May 2020, PPE MedPro was set up and given £203 million in government contracts after a referral from a Tory peer. It now appears that tens of millions of pounds of that money ended up in offshore accounts connected to the individuals involved. Profits made possible through the company's personal connections to ministers and the Tories' VIP lane that was declared illegal by the High Court. Yet ministers are still refusing to publish correspondence relating to the award of the MedPro contract because they say, Mr. Speaker, the department is engaged in a mediation process. Can the Minister today tell us if that mediation process has reached any outcome and what public funds have been recovered, if any? Will he commit to releasing all of those records, both to the COVID-19 public inquiry and to this House once it is completed? There are rightly separate investigations into Baroness Mone's conduct, but the questions this case raises are far wider. It took a motion from the opposition to force them to release records over the Randox scandal. Will they agree today to do the same in this case without being forced by the House? And can he say now what due diligence was performed in awarding the MedPro contract? Mr. Speaker, Today's reports concern just one single case. But this government has written off £10 billion alone in PPE that was deemed unfit for use, unusable, overpriced or undelivered. Worse, ministers appear to have learnt no lessons and have no shame. As families struggle to make ends meet, taxpayers will spend £700,000 a day on the storage of inadequate PPE. So, Mr Speaker, can he confirm that the government's new procurement bill will still give ministers free rein to hand out billions of pounds of taxpayers' cash all over again?
Well said.
Can I just say, can we please stick to the rules of the House? I don't make the rules. The rules are meant for us all to enter into. So please, it's happening too often. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Lady asked two main sets of questions. One is, what are we doing on PP MedPro? It's been widely reported, Mr Speaker, that it had an underperforming contract, and let me set out what we do in those cases. The first step is to send a letter before action, which outlines a claim for damages, and that is then followed by litigation in the event that a satisfactory agreement has not been reached. And to answer the Honourable Lady's question directly, we haven't got to a point where a satisfactory agreement has been reached at this stage. On the point about the high priority group, let's just be clear about what this was and wasn't, Mr Speaker. Around 9,000 people came forward, and all ministers will have experienced endless people directly ringing them up to try and help with the huge need that there was at the time. And many of us as backbenchers will have also had approaches from constituents who were keen to help and needed somewhere to be referred onto. All that route did was handle those huge number of contacts that were coming in to ministers of people offering to help. And let me be clear that it did not give you any kind of successful guarantee of a contract. Indeed, 90% of the bids that went through it were not successful. And every single bid that went through that route went through exactly the same 8-stage process as all the other contracts, looking at the quality, the price and the bona fides of the people who are offering to produce. On the point about a PPE which has not been adequate, has not been useful, I did set out at the start the extraordinary context we're operating in. There was literally a global scramble for PPE, with a situation where people were being gazumped, the goods were taken out of a warehouse if people could turn up with the cash quicker than you could. It was an extraordinary situation in which we had to act in a different way. And we all, loads of us will remember standing up in this house and saying to ministers, what are you doing to get more quickly? And that is the context that we were operating in, Mr Speaker.